Okay, Versailles 1919. What can we say about it? So, this is the third of this great statesman series that I've had, and every one of them feels completely different. It's not a series in the way that, like, coins started out, or SPI quads were, or anything like that. It's not like there's one basic set of rules. And in fact, if you look at the coin series, so much of the game is baked into the events and everything that it's very easy to do that. This is very, very different from Churchill, very, very different from Pericles. It might be that Churchill and Vienna, the Congress of Vienna, are similar. I had that feeling when I looked at the games, and I was kind of afraid of this in that, yeah, I have Churchill already. Where are they going to go? I didn't like where Pericles went. It was too. It kind of it went off in a direction that didn't really thrill me. But I also wouldn't have liked another Churchill clone. I feel like these games tend not to be all that heavily invested in, like, I don't know, the physical story that's being told on the battlefield and everything. Churchill had a couple of tracks on it. Pericles had specific locations, if I recall correctly, but it was all just felt very very different to me from how from how I'm used to my strong narratives. And this game also does not have a really powerfully strong narrative, especially since it doesn't really have a physical map type. Well, it doesn't at all have a physical map. It has a bunch of issues that need to be resolved. So it played, in a lot of ways, more like a Euro than either of the predecessors that I have do. That said, it also was a really, really nice, fast-playing Euro-type game. I felt like the decisions throughout the whole game were very, very, not necessarily trivial to make or easy, but I didn't have to spend a lot of time agonizing over them. And that's an important facet to me. I don't play games to agonize, right? I can agonize about my existential reality well enough without having to put myself in that kind of position when I'm playing a game. And I really don't like having to do that, trying to balance out, do I need to do this or that? I felt like almost every decision that I made, I could look at and I could assess its own value relatively quickly. And that's a very, very strong selling point for me. I know for some people, they don't want that. They want every fucking decision to be, vitally important and to have not absolutely easy to understand valuation behind it. But I kind of feel like if there's anything that should have a big valuation, it's more in that broad strategic side. Now, I think this game kind of falls flat. I found it very, very difficult to come up with any kind of strategic, like, positioning that I was trying to put into play. There's some tactical stuff. For example, do I want, cubes available, or do I want to go for shorter term goals that maybe I can get, but those gains might be ephemeral for all I know. There is one place where this game failed in terms of being that sort of fast-playing, enjoyable experience that I kind of like from my Euros. And I kind of look at this as a Euro, even though it's historically believable and most of the actions and everything and most of the consequences feel like they're grounded well. The way it actually plays out, I feel like I'm playing some sort of much more simplified type of design. And that one place is towards the end of the game when it feels like your best move in the game is to calculate out the victory conditions in full for every single decision you make. There are ways to get around that. Within the rules of this game, I would say the easiest way to get around that would be to simply put a time limit on each player's turn. Like their major decision, are they taking action 1, 2, or 3? Give them like a minute to make that decision. That way, if they want to spend their downtime calculating out the victory conditions on other players' turns, they can do that. I don't consider that a lot of fun myself, but that's okay. I know some people who really like to do that. And if you don't have that time limit, if somebody's allowed, if people are allowed to calculate out the current victory points again and again and again, this game is going to get so slow at the end. Not so much at the beginning. It might for some players who are, really anal retentive about trying to maximize everything. But honestly, you can usually get a pretty good picture of who's in the lead for most of the game or how close the game is, etc. What I couldn't really assess, though, is the game that I played just now was a 1-point game. The game before it was just a few points between winning and second. And there's a lot of different points spread out all over. The tableau is not easy to assess the exact amount of points that are available. Another thing that might help is a victory point track that kept track of what your current victory points were. That would be a pain in the ass to maintain. The final thing, but could be done without changing the rules of the game. Another thing that could be done is make some of the victory points kind of hidden. That often makes it more, but that would require a change in the rules. From a historical point, there were places where the cards, especially the event cards, didn't really feel like they were associated with what they appear to be. In terms of the issues and your strategy cards, you are put in kind of this position where it's hard to accept that any nation could pick any set of any strategy card that they wanted. That feels more like a game variation and balance option more than anything else. And then you also have, the deck of cards, the order the issues come out and whatnot, is not that controlled by the players. There's a lot of variance in that and a lot of randomness. And I found that enjoyable and everything. It's just, it might not be how the actual negotiations went. However, negotiations have many ways of going, right? One might be settle all the big issues first, get them out of the way, and then work around the edges. Another might be get small agreements done so that everybody starts building trust, etc. And those different strategies might be reflected in the randomness. The players aren't going to have a hell of a lot of control over that in terms of making that. Let's take a look at components. Put my pipe away because I always like to start with the board first. A good solid, mounted board, GMT quality, doesn't bulge, doesn't pit. I found the graphics on it very attractive. That is the work, I think, primarily of Donald Haggerty. Although McGowan, this is one of his, sort of last things that he works with, but I don't think he had much to do with the layout of the board. I found it very effective, had all the information that you needed, had reminders, etc. in it, and still very attractive at the same time. The cards, look, I gotta say it every time it comes up. Cards these days can be fucking fantastic now. We're talking really high quality cards. GMT tends to put that out. These shuffled well. They weren't the stupid armored cards. You have multiple different decks. You have an event deck here. You have the strategy cards, which you don't really, you shuffle up and you put a selection out that the players can choose. So that's not a big deal. Before I bury them, extra little wooden pieces of one of each type. GMT's good about that. What really impressed me in a way, and I don't know why, just because I like it, was the tarot-sized cards for the issues. They gave more room for the issues, but mainly I just like that size. I wouldn't want it for my normal deck, but it's cool to see it showing up. And, you've got so much capability in terms of production choices nowadays. It's cool to see that happening, I guess. I don't know. What can you say about cubes and discs? Well, one little thing, I found that I had to mark the discs with a 2 on them, just as a reminder. It was a helpful mnemonic as to where a military unit came from, in case it was bid and then not exhausted, so it went back where it belonged. I still had to work around it. That little number isn't enough. The counters, good quality, rounded, didn't need to trim them at all. Could have sanded them, a couple of them, get a little piece of something, but a little nail file or whatever does whatever you want for that. You have to keep in mind that you have an extra cube and an extra disc. The cube, probably the harder thing to keep in mind. That's why I've got them separated out. There were some excess cards as well, because there were replacements for some of the cards. Oddly enough, there were replacements for cards that weren't in the deck already, or whatever, errata cards that didn't make it into the printing, but maybe they thought, hey, let's put these extras in at the end. Victory point sheet, I mean, not necessary, but a cool little step. I don't mind it at all. A single one that you needed to photocopy is not as cool to me. I'd rather have a pad like this. I don't know what costs more, what costs less. It probably all changes over the years. And then you got a solo player aid, which I did not use. I don't bother with the solo game. The base rule book, we'll talk about that. Had a few issues in it where I felt like it didn't explain things. It didn't really nail things down completely, but most of it was perfect. It's not a complex game, so that's not too surprising. The playbook, necessary for understanding one of the rules issues at least, maybe more than one. It gives a complete game played out in it. That's kind of different from most. Usually they don't give you the whole game. A historical commentary on the event cards, not terribly detailed or whatever, but look, if they have extra pages, it's cool. The design notes themselves, I think I talked about these already. I think I talked about everything already. Didn't give the kind of information I really like in a design notes. It gave more about, and I always kind of complain about this when it happens, gave more about how did we come to this game and get around it, and how much work was it, as opposed to, look, these were the decisions and these were the things we threw out and this is why, and that kind of stuff. There was a little bit of that, but it wasn't, the decision of what to throw out wasn't that, was more of the lines of just, yeah, it just wasn't possible, about an initial idea with using maps and changing borders and everything, which would have been very cool if it could have been done, I'm sure, but yeah. I gotta say, though, the style of game may have made it so that, like, the kind of design decisions would have been made more for play balance and intensity of play and enjoyment and stuff like that, rather than really driving deep into the history and trying to say this really reflects this because of that. This is more of just a simple bidding game. The mechanism could have been used in a lot of different places. Very much a Euro in that sense. Let me check how my battery's doing. I may need to... Yeah, we may be able to get through. I'd rather not have to compile a video and just load up a single one. What about the different elements in the game? Look, there's basically one player turn situation. So I guess early on the setup, you have your choice of how long a game you want to play and how many players, obviously, but which can change things. There's bots in the two-player game. I can't see a game like this in two, or solo for that matter, just because it seems like of a lesser experience to me, which is why I didn't even bother with it. But you do have this initial choice of how long a game you want to play. And I had worries at first that the long game would stay too long, that it would get too crowded and too busy. It does have some effects on how some of the strategy cards play out. Some of their values of the strategy cards become weakened by a longer or shorter game, depending on how you want to look at that. And most of them increase kind of monotonically, but there are some that are not as good a choice if you're playing the longer game. And I don't know if there was any attempt to balance them for anything other than the basic game, because they feel like you look at the card and you say, oh, this one has a definite negative to it, and the rest of them don't, or something along those lines. Like you can see some that have a definite factor that reduces their value in the longer game, or possibly increase. I mean, most of them just, again, increase most of the options, but there are a couple which are just bad in the shorter game, and I don't know that their other qualities make up for having a penalty on them. They might actually grow faster in a longer game. So yeah, the core of the game is really this really simple, the player turn level of it, where you have three simple choices for your political action. Place your influence, or scoop up influence from the used pool in military, or settle an issue, probably one that you're in the lead in, but it just has to be one that has somebody's influence on it and their advantages to doing that, even if you're not in the lead, or at least some valuation to that in terms of getting cubes back under certain circumstances. Sometimes in terms of just being able to control the flow of play, being able to ditch a card into somebody's hands who's not doing that well. But settle an issue is the big thing. That's the let's resolve something, and it throws you into a whole slew of different mechanisms that we'll talk about in a little bit. In addition, either before or after your political action, you may take a military action. And there's two military actions. One is to deploy to the different regions of the game, which might cost you happiness and influence cubes. And then the other is to demobilize one of your military units, which gains you happiness. We'll talk more about happiness. Well, let's talk about happiness, sure. Happiness is going to be important at the end of the game for a victory point side of things. But it also reflects the choices that you make on issues in terms of when you resolve an issue, what you want to pick. And I felt like happiness, at least for me, was more the driving force than little victory point changes I might get. Here's why. When I capture an issue, when I resolve an issue in my favor and I get it and I get those victory points for that issue, that's a clear thing that I can see. But that issue might get loose again. I might get it again, somebody else might get it, and then they make the choice on the specifics of what happiness changes go into play, but also what little tokens, what little counters that are going to be important at the end of the game for victory points. So for most of the game, I largely ignored the victory point markers, because they're like 1 point on a card that might be, well, might be as high as 7, but is in the 4 to 5 range for the decent cards. The weak ones are 3s, the higher ones go above that. 4s tend to be pretty common. And so, I'm looking at, I'm putting 4 points in the bank, and then maybe a point or two that matters to me. Whereas with the happiness, it has an effect on whether or not you're going to have military units available throughout that early part of the game. And you want to have them available for kind of as long as you can keep them, but you can gain more happiness by demobilizing. So it's kind of this weird balance with that. But also, those happiness points, those are real points that can't be taken away from you. They can be modified up and down and whatnot by other selections on the issue cards, but you actually get to bank them on a track, right? If I bank one of these, I don't know what they're even called, issue card icons is kind of what they're, I don't know. But if I'm banking a chit that fits my strategy card, then that chit may go away if the issue gets moved into the unresolved status again and has to be bid on again. And it's only late in the game for especially high value issues that you can have any kind of certainty that your chits on them are going to actually stay. The other thing is, very early in the game, you don't have a strategy at all. I mean, you might have one personally, but you don't have a strategy card which tells you what your special victory conditions are. You get to pick those to some extent. Oddly enough, the person who has the least issues gets the most choice on what their strategy is, and it's not based on what you've done, right? So like that whole part feels really weird to me. The strategy cards part feels the least historical to me, because nations can pick national strategies that just don't align with what they want. That might actually be a good strategy to take in the game. It might be a lousy one, but one of the things is, you could be appear to be locked in on a certain strategy, picking certain things, and then because you won a lot of issues before that first unrest when the strategy cards fall, you end up not getting the first choice. So the things that you're kind of locked into on your, with the choices you made, other people take advantage of the strategy that you've already been sort of playing towards, and they grab the card that applies more to that. That does allow for some working together, perhaps. I don't know. When you actually settle an issue, it's going to trigger off a whole sequence of events. First thing it triggers off is the opportunity to choose. Well, first of all, you look and see who won the issue, who has the most cubes on it. And there's some nice interactions there in terms of like not being able to play cubes unless you can win an issue, and having to play cubes on 2 issues, which can like really restrict your play and create some interesting little dynamics there. Again, I don't know how realistic any of them are, but they're interesting. I forgot to talk about the die. Standard quality for a GMT die, but looks so different from all the others that I'm like, yeah, this goes into this game, and I don't put it in my pool of dice for whatever reason. I've already talked about that, but whatever. So, where were we? Yeah, when you settle an issue, it triggers off a whole series of things. First, you determine who won the issue by the number of cubes they have. That person then chooses one of the options on the issue and enacts what fires off from that. And that can be kind of not a trivial choice. Sometimes you might want the little tokens that give you victory points at the end of the game. I tended more towards maximizing happiness at any given time. Usually those two kind of go together, but maybe not always, because your strategy card, again, may not align with your nation's interests. And then you put it over in your bank of issues that you have with the strategy chits on it. The strategy chits will affect everybody's victory points. The bank of issues is really mainly yours. Then you take the event that's already been put forward into the conference table, and you resolve what effect it has. Now, that may be controlled by a player who selected to put a cube on it before and gets to make decisions on it. If they don't have any decisions, there's not going to be a cube on them. They don't even take cubes usually. But if there's no cube on it, if nobody paid to have control of that event, then the person who resolved the issue, regardless of whether they want it or not, is the one who gets to control the event. Now, there is a reason why you might want to resolve an issue that you don't have the lead on. Maybe you want to clear it out of the way, but you also get an advantage to getting your own cubes back from it if you're losing it and stuff like that. You might also just want to control the tableau of the board better by on your turn taking an issue and resolving it. Then you select one of the waiting room issues to promote to the conference table and one of the waiting room events to promote to the conference table. The issue you promote might be one you already have thrown cubes on. Set yourself up in a position where you'll be able to maybe resolve another issue next turn. Maybe one that's greatly to your advantage. The event, if it has any choices on it, you have the option to put one of your influence cubes on it, and then you will control that event when the next issue is resolved, which can be a very, very powerful tool. And then finally, you have some options of pulling cards from the issue discard pile or taking a couple from the top of the deck and picking one and discarding the other to refresh the waiting room. And then you refresh the events in the waiting room by pulling an event, but this is the true event here, and this is where the nastiest shit tends to happen, the unrest checks and everything. That event has an automatic just takes place and nobody has any control over it, etc., when it goes into the waiting room. Now, I guess the biggest thing that the events can do, sometimes they just move stuff around on the tracks, the unrest track and whatnot, but the biggest thing they can kind of do is force an unrest check. And that can loosen an issue that somebody already won control over, and then it's up for bidding again in an immediate sort of fast bidding round, where the person who controlled it last has some advantages. They get to put cubes and military elements into it beforehand. The military side of the game is largely trying to protect issues that you control. If you control a lot of issues in a region, you may need a military in the region to make sure that you don't have your issues pushed into the uncontrolled zone. It can also reduce the chance of unrest in an issue, in a region. It could increase it too if you really wanted to. Like if you fell behind in that region after having a military involvement there. So there's a lot of cool shit going on with that. The actual scoring of the game is a fairly complex procedure. There's a lot of points out there. There's the simple points on the card. There's all the tokens on the cards aligning to your strategy cards. There's tokens that have your flag that are on issues that you resolved, which for whatever reason give you a bonus point. Even if you kind of resolved, I don't know, you'd resolve it in your country's favor if that's the case. But why it matters who made the resolution feels a little funky to me. You know, I mean, like Britain should be just as happy with like South African expansion, whether they were the ones who made who took control of that issue that causes it, or if some other person did it due to a diplomatic deal or something. Feels kind of odd that your flags don't count except if you resolved them. Not sure why. That's again one of the places where I feel like, yeah, it feels to me like they made a game balance decision on that instead of just, yeah, that's just a good thing. Now you already get the happiness. If you're getting good counters of your own, you'll probably end up getting happiness for it. What I've seen, there's also the neat little game end mechanism. One of the issue cards placed at a predetermined point in the deck, when it flips up, denotes when an issue that, when resolved, ends the game immediately. So it's a high value issue, and the players, as we saw in the game that I played on video, and in the one before for that matter, might be competing heavily for. So there's something kind of interesting about that. Overall, I found that the victory conditions allowed for a lot of room to kind of play around and not be absolutely certain what your best choice is in any given situation. But all that without like putting this kind of burden that I hate, that feels like I have to, or can even, completely calculate everything. Only at the very end of the game did I feel that. Overall, again, I think this is my favorite of the series. I view it as a very Euro-type game, and a cool one. One of those Euro-type games that I like, as opposed to some kind of war game. It surely hell isn't a war game. Compare it more to things like Illuminati or I don't know what else. It's a card control game and all that. Maybe some of the Eklund stuff, but the decision making felt a lot cleaner and easier on for me than something with than one of the Eklund games did. Any of them. Knowledge of the game of the issues in play is probably important, and probably and doesn't spoil the game as far as I'm concerned. Knowledge of the events might kind of spoil the narrative of being in this situation in a developing world situation. But knowledge of the issues that are going to be resolved at the table probably is a good idea, and I don't think hurts the historical aspect at all. It's not like you should be surprised. The one thing that kind of does hurt it is that you're kind of surprised you might not get to certain issues. You don't have the kind of control to push issues forward that you really care about. The other thing is, what I found was there was a tendency to avoid issues that you really care about, because the ones that you care about hold a negative for you. Like your nation cares about, let's say Fiume for the Italians. They really care about Fiume. That means that they are invested in it no matter what, even if it's a low value issue, because there's too much happiness cost, too many other effects in play that they'd really rather not see. So you tend to bury the issues you care about and promote the issues you don't give a shit about, just as sort of a close-in tactical thing. That feels a little wrong. But yeah, I really enjoyed the play. I don't know if you learn a hell of a lot about, the negotiations and the tactics that were used and the deals and trades that were there. There is some beautiful opportunity for deal making, but it's generally hey, we both get an advantage if this happens. Let's work it out together and do it this way, and maybe I'll give you a less advantageous option than you could possibly get, but an assured one by cutting a deal at a certain point. But anyway, yeah, I enjoyed it, but I don't see it as, you know, hugely giving a tremendous amount of insight into how the negotiations actually operate. Cheers. It's a game more than a simulation of the conference.